Well, the previous lecture showed that banks create money, and the next question is, does that matter? Okay? Because the neoclassical will find any way to say these things don't matter when it's easy to prove, as I do in this lecture, that money does matter. So bank money creation, the last model I showed you in that lecture, positive credit increased GDP and negative credit reduced it. So that's contrary to the neoclassical myth that credit doesn't have any impact upon the real economy. But I was still working totally in monetary terms. So I want to now prove that credit does matter, contradicting yet again what mainstream economists teach you in their courses. Now, if you look back and see just how much impact this has, Ben Bernanke, who basically got the job as being governor of the Federal Reserve on the basis of his work on the Great Depression, dismissed Irving Fisher's explanation that the crisis is due to what he called a debt deflation. And the reason that mainstream economists, including Bernanke, rejected Fisher's explanation was he said that there's a counter argument that debt deflation is no more than a redistribution from one group, debtors, to another group, creditors. There's problems with that, but I'll just leave it at this stage at the moment. And he then said, absent implausibly large differences in marginal spending propensities between debtors and creditors, pure redistributions, which is how they regard lending, should have no significant macroeconomic effects. And Krugman, modern, yet another so-called modern neoclassical, said that it's the distribution of debt that matters, not the level of debt. So he said, to a first approximation, debt is money we owe to ourselves, and that's true. He said, therefore, the over level of debt makes no difference to aggregate net worth. One person's liability is another person's asset, which is also true. But he then says the level doesn't matter, only the distribution of debt. And I'm going to show why that's wrong. And the reason is because both Krugman and Bernanke are using the model in which banks are just intermediaries between borrowers and savers. And that model, in that model, if that was the real world, they'd be right. But of course, that model is not the real world. And when you look at the real world, credit is part of aggregate demand and income. Your spending depends upon how much money you borrow. That becomes part of your spending, and it becomes part of the income to the person you buy something from. So I want to show that you can actually use the one element of macroeconomics that everybody agrees on, if anybody thinks about it at all. Expenditure is income. What you spend becomes income for somebody else. And I can display this using what I call a Moore table, which I invented and will one day include in Minsky, but I've named it after Basil Moore, another great post-Keynesian economist. And this is a table that shows all expenditures horizontally and all incomes vertically, and divides this economy into different sectors to show that. So let's just work with three sectors. We have households, services, manufacturing. And I'm showing household expenditure on services and manufacturing, and income from services and manufacturing, and so on for the other two sectors. So for household spending, $A per year on services and $B per year in manufacturing. Services spend $C per year in households and $D per year on manufacturing. And manufacturing spends $E per year on households and F per year on services. Now, for each row, the outcome is zero, and the total outcome is zero as well, which is why we talk about gross domestic product rather than net domestic product. So you have expenditure being identical to income on each row, but the columns can be non-zero because households can spend less on services and manufacturing than they earn from those two. But the total of all the various columns also has to sum to zero. Now I'm ignoring intrasectoral spending, but I ignore household spending on households, services spending on services, and so on. But if you took this to the limit and had every monetary entity in the economy in one of these tables, which in America's case would be something like 370 million rows and columns, in the limit, that would capture all of expenditure and all of income, and it would measure GDP. So I'm going to start from the identity that is income is identical to expenditure, and then divide the economy into those sectors, as I said, and I'm showing expenditure on the horizontal and income on the vertical, and all flows are in dollars per year. Now, what that means is, and you'll see this table in a moment, the negative of the sum of the diagonal is aggregate expenditure. This is minus A minus B minus C minus D minus E minus F dollars per year. That sum, the negative of that sum is aggregate expenditure. whereas the off-diagonal is aggregate income. It'll be obvious once you see the table. So let's look at the simplest case where there's neither lending nor banking. So we have household spending, and I'll back over to my other screen here, spending A dollars per year on services and B dollars per year on manufacturing. When you add up the row, you get zero. Same for services and manufacturing. And then the vertical is giving you households income, which is C plus E, minus their expenditure, which is A plus B. And so that can be non-negative, but the overall sum ends up being zero. Now, if you take, therefore, the sum of the negative sum of the diagonals is aggregate expenditure. The positive sum of the off diagonals is aggregate income. And they're identical, and they have to be identical. Okay? Now let's look at the neoclassical model of loanable funds, which it's a slightly different myth to the fractional reserve banking, but one myth supports the other. And this is idea where you have a non-bank lending to another non-bank. So I'm going to choose the non-bank being the service sector, lending credit dollars per year to households. Here's a flow of dollars, which is not a sale, so that's why it's not occurring along the same row. So it lends credit dollars per year to households. And the reason it's doing that is because since the households therefore have debt to the service sector, they have to service the households pay interest to the services sector. Now it's doing exactly the same exercise and do our sums there. And what you'll notice is that interest turns up as part of aggregate income and aggregate expenditure. Credit cancels because there's looking at the rows, there's a positive entry for credit here and a negative entry there, and there's a negative entry for credit here and a positive element for credit there. So credit cancels out. So when you look at the loanable funds model, there is no role for credit in aggregate demand and income. So if loanable funds were true, then the neoclassicals would be right to ignore credit and private debt, because in the aggregate there'd be no impact of credit and aggregate demand, just the impact of interest payments. Let's look at the real world, and what I call the real world. The term you'll find in the post-Keynesian literature is endogenous money. That only makes sense to somebody who's part of the literature. So I've renamed that to be bank-originated money and debt, which makes more sense. And it's got a very nice acronym as well. So here we have banks lending credit dollars per year to households, and then households spending credit dollars per year on manufacturing. Now, to show this, I've got to include the assets and liabilities of the banking sector, because the way they create money, as I showed in the last time, is increasing their assets and increasing their liabilities at the same time. So here we have the bank creating credit dollars per year is debt, and adding credit dollars per year to the bank account of the household sector. And then I've got the household spending all of that credit on the manufacturing sector. Now, when you do take your diagonal sum, or you take your off diagonal sum, credit does not disappear. Credit's only turning up once in both elements. And what you find is credit doesn't cancel out. That explains why credit plays an essential role in a monetary economy. And it's so essential for numerous reasons. The main reason is that credit can grow radically very quickly, and it can also go negative. That doesn't apply to ordinary transactions. So if you take a look at American data, and this is going back to the Great Depression and also the global financial crisis, and then the longer data set over here goes right back to the 1890s in terms of government debt, and back to the 1830s in terms of, well, that's 1790, pardon me, and the 1830s in terms of private debt. What you find is the Great Depression and the global financial crisis both occurred with a period of negative credit. And then it's even more extreme when you take a look at the event I didn't even know happened until I plotted the bottom chart there, what's called the Panic of 1837. They all involve negative credit. So there's the negative credit of what's called the Panic of 1837. And literally, no joke, finding this in the data alerted me to the fact that this actually happened, because historically we tend to forget about it. There's the Great Depression, which is the longest period of negative credit, and there's the global financial crisis, which in America's case was the first time credit had turned negative since the Second World War. Now that's the topic of the next lecture, and that's going to be on where what are called Minsky moments come from. But for what I want to do now for the moment is continue expanding on the role of private credit money in creation in macroeconomics. So the model that I'd showed beforehand just showed the bank's view. I've only shown one godly table, in other words. But if you actually want to see a complete view of a monetary system, then you need a godly table for the banks, a godly table for the private sector, and a godly table for the central bank. And Minsky enables you to do that, and it makes sure the tables are self-consistent. To have a banking sector view, a non-bank private sector, which is you and me and corporations, and a central bank. And this is what it looks like. So that's the model I showed at the end of the last lecture. Didn't have all of this. Now, I'm going to go into more detail on how you build a model like this in Minsky in later lectures. But what can you see that is playing no role in what's going on in this private money creation system? Think about it for a second. Okay? There's one clear difference between this realistic picture of what banks do and what mainstream economists teach. And that is that reserves play no role whatsoever. Reserves don't turn up in this model of lending. It would if I include banks giving cash loans. It would if I broke the banking sector into more than one bank and then showed the interbank transfers going on. But in the fundamental action of banks creating money by creating credit and then boosting aggregate demand and then causing it to fall when credit goes negative, reserves don't even turn up. So what are reserves for? Okay, it's blank. What are they for? And to answer that question, those two questions, we have to answer that by looking at government money creation, which is the topic of the next part of this lecture.